And we're at the time of today's show where I get to speak with our guest. And I'm going to be having a conversation with Yuin and Biodiversity Council Co-Chief Councillor, Dr Jack Pascoe. And he's here to speak to us about a new special collection released in the journal Wildlife Research, of which he is an editor. Jack, welcome to Indigenuity.
Thanks for having me, Krystal.
Absolute pleasure. Now, this collection aims to recognise and celebrate the leadership and collaboration of Indigenous Australians in wildlife research. Could you tell us a little bit about how this collection came about and your editorial role?
Yeah, sure. So it was, I guess, a collection that was suggested by one of the associate editors at Wildlife Research, Sarah Legg, who's got a wonderful, had a wonderful role in collaborating with traditional custodians right across the country. And she brought together several of us to, I guess, be guest editors of the journal or the collection. And yeah, we were able to gather, quite a large collection of papers from across the country, which was really exciting.
And you say that this research harnesses a right-way science approach, which blends approaches of Indigenous knowledge with Western science methodologies. Could you tell us a bit more about what this idea is of a right way to approaching wildlife research in collaboration?
Yeah, look, I think it's a great question and really important one and core, I guess, to the way that we approach this. We wanted to make sure that all of the research that was published as part of the collection had genuine partnerships with Indigenous people, so it wasn't, I guess, Indigenous custodians were playing the role within the research that they wanted to. And by that, I mean that, there was a focus on Indigenous priorities as part of the research, and that Indigenous people were given the choice to lead research if they wanted, or to be authors of research if they wanted to do that. It was also really important to us that things like Indigenous cultural intellectual property were protected in appropriate manners, and that we gave an opportunity for the publications to have an abstract that was written. An abstract is basically an upfront summary of the paper in science literature, and we gave authors an opportunity to have one in the Indigenous language that was most relevant to the paper where the research was conducted. So I guess those were sort of the key things that we were looking for to make sure it was done in the right way.
And in general, when looking at, I guess, like science research, and particularly when we're focusing on ideas of country, which very naturally we would expect to have Indigenous perspectives and knowledges informing that process, what are some gaps that you see in the state of that at the moment, and what are some ways we might be able to move forward in a right way?
I think we're probably at a point where we're turning the corner on just having a quantum of studies that have made their way into peer-reviewed literature that push these ideas of country, but also this right-way approach to science. I think we're starting to close that gap. And this collection, I guess, is part of addressing sort of the dearth of Indigenous-led and genuine partnership projects. And there have been other collections, like one from a few years ago in ecological management and restoration. I think these are really important because they bring together, I guess, a range of research and a range of different models of traditional custodians being involved in that research. And I guess they highlight the different manners in which that can occur. And I think we have a real range within this collection of the types of projects you can see happening, from those that are led by Indigenous academics doing research on their country or on others' country. You also see, I guess, the idea of in traditional custodians putting their priorities and perspectives forward, whether that's by acknowledging and identifying culturally significant entities and inviting non-Indigenous researchers in to help the traditional custodians answer important questions to that group. And then you see the mutual benefits, I guess, as well for non-Indigenous researchers coming into country and in respectful relationships with traditional custodians, the ability to, I guess, increase the impact of their work is greatly increased. Just the access of traditional knowledge that can help inform the research, but also the large areas of country that mob are custodians of and have access to through the Indigenous estate. So I think they were really the important things that we're able to bring together as part of the collection.
Yeah, incredibly powerful. And could you give us a little bit of a snapshot insight into what are some of the voices that are a part of this collection? What are some of the topics that they're looking at?
Yeah, great. So I think we had some wonderful examples, like I mentioned, of mob identifying culturally significant species. For instance, in Arnhem Land, the Iroquois Rangers came together with non-Indigenous researchers to basically identify all the species that were of cultural significance to them, and also looking at the species that, from a Western science perspective, were considered to be endangered or threatened in some way, and starting to, I guess, take a clear-eyed look at, well, where can we find the commonalities in the way we might be able to manage these species, but also the country that they're dependent on. There's also a really wonderful sort of example of up in Gambanga country, where they identified the golden tip bat as a culturally significant species, and then the research was around how mobs' Indigenous knowledge around weaving could be used to make basically nests for these species on their country. So real range in terms of culturally significant entities. We've also had massive bits of research that covered territories right across, particularly in Central Australia, that looked at things like fire and predator-prey interactions. And some of these, I guess, went right across many mobs' lands. For instance, we had a look at one looking at planned fire across the Tanami Desert, and others that sort of identifying, I guess, the way that different species of interest that occur right across different language groups, like the Western, the white-throated grass wren, in the Arnhem Plateau, I guess, responds to different factions or elements of country. And, that was a collaboration between Wardakan Rangers, Jarwin Rangers, Jurubal Rangers, and Mimmel Rangers. So these are really, I guess, big undertakings with a lot of collaboration between groups and researchers.
And one of the, I guess, one of the values of this collection is this idea of reciprocity being an important component of successful partnerships. Could you tell us a bit about the role, like the function of reciprocity in this type of collection and collaboration?
Yeah, it's a good point, Krystal, and it's something that I don't think researchers tend to go into projects thinking about reciprocity from a Western perspective. It's something that we think about in Indigenous cultures all the time. But there are a hell of a lot of opportunities with research of this nature to give back into community. There's the obvious things like, I guess, paying people for their time when they're collaborating with you, but also the opportunity for two-way learning. So, I guess researchers are going into country often expecting, to take in Indigenous knowledge, and sometimes that's appropriate. But also there's skills that researchers have, and they're privileges, these skills that we hold, whether that's working with wildlife, working with plants, that we can feed back into community and help, young rangers, young Indigenous researchers gather those skills and become, I guess, the next generation of researchers and traditional custodians. There's also things like authorship of papers, which I think this collection's been really good at demonstrating, whereby we have Indigenous researchers leading papers, we have Indigenous community members being collaborators or co-authors on papers, country is being acknowledged as an author. and collectives. So ranger groups are being recognised in as well with authorship, which is really important because it acknowledges the contribution of these individuals and groups to the research, and it also ensures that knowledge and those opportunities for learning stay within the community. So, reciprocity is enormous in Aboriginal communities, and I guess it's wonderful to be able to demonstrate that Western science can also, demonstrate that model in some way through collections like this.
Mm. Yeah, no, incredibly important, but delightful to see the many ways in which these collaborations can feed both ways. I know this is a bit of a sort of tough question and perhaps a bit of a downer question, but I guess in the face of, a lot of the climate stresses that we're seeing, the impact on country, how urgent do you feel these types of collaborations in conservation are?
Look, it's a downer in some ways and not in others, because I think Indigenous Australia is really an untapped resource in terms of its knowledge and understanding of country, and the fact that our communities tend to be on country a lot, and so we observe things that others don't, that researchers who come and do their project and leave, that tends to be the pattern, can't see. I mean, that's a gross generalisation. But I think it's a really important one. If Australia is to meet its international commitments to things like biodiversity loss and meeting that in a genuine way, we have to work with traditional custodians. Things like the Indigenous estate take up a vast amount of the land mass of Australia. We have to work with traditional custodians and resource traditional custodians to look after their country. And I think, just knowing and observing country is going to be really important for understanding ways in which we can adapt to a changing world. And I think traditional custodians are the best place to sort of lead that, to be honest, Krystal.
I'd have to say I agree with you on that one, Jack. Thank you so much for your time today. This is an incredible collection. For any of our listeners, it's in the journal Wildlife Research. There is a team of guest editors, including Dr Jack Pascoe, and a very delightful team contributing. And the collection is Indigenous and Cross-Cultural Wildlife Research in Australia. Jack, thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks for having me, Krystal.